Stand fast, therefore, in the liberty wherewith Christ hath made us free, and be not entangled again with the yoke of bondage. Galatians chapter 5, verse 1. Please be seated. I think this is the first time that I will be preaching a 4th of July sermon on the 4th of July. This was always my favorite subject in school. I mean, I loved history, but I loved we'd always start with the American Revolution, and we might get up to the Civil War, but every time it came around, I was excited. Would we still win, right? I think we did it in 2nd grade, and then in 8th grade, and then AP US History in the 11th grade. So I'm going to give you a bit of a history lesson. We're going to go through some American history today because you're dealing with a history major, and this is one of my favorite topics. So I do have a sermon handout for you that if you didn't get, you should have it. But look on with a neighbor if you can't find it. And when we get to that part of the sermon, I will direct you to it. Now, 245 years ago, the 13 colonies were in rebellion against King George III of England. And they charged that king with a breach of contract for failing to uphold the feudal rights, the ancient rights of Englishmen in the colonies. And they accused him of being a tyrant. Now, they had some pretty good legal precedent for this because they looked to the Parliament of the United Kingdom, who just a century before had beheaded one king and deposed another for the same reason, for being a tyrant. So the Americans thought they were completely justified in declaring King George a tyrant and throwing off his yoke. If Parliament could do it, then why couldn't the United Colonies do it as well? And so on July 4th, 1776, in the Declaration of Independence, we read the signatories who put their names to it. We read them saying, "The history of the present King of Great Britain is a history of repeated injuries and usurpations, all having in direct object the establishment of an absolute tyranny over these states. A prince whose character is thus marked by every act which may define a tyrant is unfit to be the ruler of a free people." So the question I have to ask for all of you today is what is a free people? What makes a people free? And what did they mean by it then? And what do we mean by it now? So the history part of the sermon, the history lesson, the run-up to the Revolution. The American Revolution's events are deeply rooted in English history. Back 700 years to the Norman Conquest, the year 1066, when William of Normandy defeats the Saxon king Harold at the Battle of Hastings. Now, not since the days of the Roman Caesars had this little island nation been under a continental yoke, and freedom was in peril, and her people at risk. But armed with the Christian faith and common law, the Saxons fought back. And on a bright summer day in June of 1215, Magna Carta was signed. The rebel barons brought King John to heel and forced him to acknowledge that there was an authority above that of the king. Now, what was that authority? Was it the authority of the church? Was it the authority of the barons? Was it the rule of law? Not until the Glorious Revolution in 1688, and even our own American Revolution nearly a century later, would that question be answered. Now, to understand the tug of war that would consume nearly the next 600 years of English history, I want you to think about two opposing poles, north and south sort of, and then two opposite hemispheres, east and west. And this is where your handout will come in handy because I've made a diagram of it. Now, the hemispheres, the left and the right, are what we might call localism or feudal rights, which have been historically pitted against absolutism or centralism in our English story, the divine right of kings. And on the the vertical, we have two different orders, the divine order and then the secular order, the order of God and the order of man. Now, as things become centralized in the sacred order, which is sort of your upper right quadrant there, you start to see absolutist institutions like the papacy. And this is not a critique on any individual pope, but on the office itself, which declares itself supreme over the church universal. You start to see things like prelacy, which is the rule of monarchical bishops. And as you go down, as things centralize on the secular order, you start to see things like the rise of nation states, of kings and parliaments that have absolute rule of the divine right. Now, if you look to the other side of the diagram, the left side, we start to see that as things are localized in the sacred order, we see congregations taking precedent. We see things like kings being able to decide who the bishop is. And on the local level, on the secular order, we start to see things like towns and counties and societies and associations take precedent that pull power back away from the center. We see things like local color. We see things like the right to emigrate, to seek your destiny. So there's this tug of war between these two poles, sacred and secular, and between these two ideas of localism and centralism. So English history is really could be plotted anywhere on this grid. In 1170, King Henry II was asserting his feudal rights over the church, and so he murdered the Archbishop Thomas Becket in his cathedral. Thomas Becket was asserting the right of the church over the crown, the right of an international organization based in Rome to declare what was what when it came to the faith in England. Later on, the Stuart kings would attempt to govern by a centralized and absolute divine right. King Charles I was beheaded by Parliament and to his dying day refused to recognize the authority of that Parliament. Parliament found itself briefly running things from 1649 to 1662 during the Republic under Cromwell, found it really couldn't get things done and needed a legislature, needed an executive, so they brought back the kings. But the Stuart kings that they brought back were still given to looking at centralizing power. Their inspiration was Louis, the Sun King in France, who considered himself a god on earth. The Jesuits were active in England at the time, kept trying to bring England back under the Roman papacy and the yoke of the Pope. Parliament finally had enough and deposed James II and brought in William and Mary. And ever since then, it has been a requirement that the crowned head of the United Kingdom be a member of the Church of England and a Protestant. But something else happened in that moment. The question of whose authority, who reigned and ruled in England, was decided. And the compromise of 1688 was that the king would reign, everything would be done in the king's name while Parliament ruled. And so power was centralized in a concept called king in Parliament. And this crown, this king in Parliament, advises the crown, tells the crown what to do. It tells the church what to do. And it seems to have almost an absolute authority over the lives of its citizens. And this was recognized on the eve of the American Revolution. Those of you who are lawyers will have read or have heard of a man named Blackstone, whose famous commentary on English common law is still studied to this day. And Blackstone wrote, "If Parliament will positively enact a thing to be done which is unreasonable, I know of no power in the ordinary form of the Constitution that is vested with authority to control it." So there's no power above Parliament. Well, our founding fathers said no to this. The colonists distrusted Parliament, in part because they had no representation in it, and in part because they thought it had usurped their freedoms. The colonists, you see, were very much on the lower left quadrant here. They believed that local problems were best handled by local solutions, and they trusted themselves to solve their problems in a variety of unique and different ways, rather than simply having uniformity imposed on them. What freedom meant to the colonists then in 1776 was independence from a faraway central government. But it also meant that they had a right as independent groups to develop on their own. Because you have to remember, how was this country settled? How were these 13 colonies settled? Well, entire English villages picked up stake and moved to Massachusetts. They threw their lot in together. They had a group destiny that they put under the hand of God to guide them, and that they would realize together. The whole idea of sort of this John Wayne rugged individual didn't come till much later. America was very much an idea of you found the group that you belong to, and you rose or fell with that group. And so Baptists came, and Quakers came, and Scotch-Irish Presbyterians came, and Germans from the Palatines came. And even later, after this country was independent, we still see this idea of group destiny in the utopian movements like the Oneida Colony, or even the Mormons who began here in New York and trekked all the way out to Utah. So that's another thing that freedom meant for the colonists in 1776. The last thing that freedom meant for the colonists is something that's still very much with us today. You see, in England, things were established. The church was established. The universities were established. If you weren't a member of the Church of England, you didn't get to go to college. If you didn't subscribe to the 39 Articles, you didn't get to sit in Parliament. All of these things were determined, centralized, uniform, codified. That's why we call it the Book of Common Prayer. There was no license to deviate. Well, what happened here is since nothing was established, we were able to establish our own societies, our own associations. And so you see throughout the land to this day various colleges that were founded by religious groups. You see primary schools that were founded by various sects. You see seminaries, you see societies, you see lending libraries. You see all kinds of fraternal organizations, all of these being for the benefit of their members and also to promote the general welfare. So all of this was what was meant by freedom when those men put their names to that declaration. Now that's the account that I grew up with, and that's the account that I think every American school child grew up with for many years. But times have changed, and there have always been alternate accounts, right? There have always been different ways of telling this story. One of which was the Loyalist story, the Tory story, right? I mean, a third of the colonists remained loyal to the crown, and they were rather brutally persecuted after the war. Their property was confiscated, they were exiled to Canada or the Caribbean or had to go back to England. So it wasn't entirely everyone on the same page. Of course, there is a group that was excluded for a worse reason, and that was the fact of their slavery. The African slaves were completely excluded from any talk of independence. The New Englanders' penchant for migration soon took him west, and in 1830, Tocqueville noted that the state of Connecticut, the little state of Connecticut, had sent 36 delegates to Congress, but only 5 came from the state of Connecticut, which means that all of these people born in Connecticut had gone and migrated west to the western states where they were sent back to Congress. But this West, the Wild West, was not exactly empty. There were Indians there were Frenchmen, there were Mexicans, and so the idea of manifest destiny was invented to justify this expansion of greater New England. But again, as Tocqueville noted, even in 1830, freeborn blacks and freed slaves were prevented from participating in this great migration, this profitable migration. States or territories like Ohio had strict whites-only policies. So there is a whole other side to this story that I certainly am aware of. And there are things in our history that we very much may wish didn't happen. And as we look around today, we see even some of the monuments to that history being toppled. And so we have to ask ourselves, where are we today? Are we a united country or a divided country? Do we still know what freedom means? Quoting Jesus, Lincoln said, "A house divided against itself cannot stand." He added, "I believe this government cannot endure, permanently half slave and half free. I do not expect the Union to be dissolved," he said. "I do not expect the house to fall, but I do expect it will cease to be divided. It will become all one thing or all the other." And it seems to me that we stand now where Lincoln stood then. We are, it seems to me, about to become all one thing or all the other. And in that regard, I am not confident that freedom is winning. And I think that's because we have forgotten what freedom is and whose it is to give it. And so finally, I come to my text for today, Galatians chapter 5, verse 1, and also verses 13 and 15. Stand fast, therefore, in the liberty wherewith Christ hath made us free, and be not entangled again with the yoke of bondage. For brethren, ye have been called unto liberty. Only use not liberty for an occasion to the flesh, but by love serve one another. For all the law is fulfilled in one word, even in this, thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself. But if ye bite and devour one another, take heed that ye are not consumed by one another. Christ didn't give us liberty. He didn't set us at liberty so that we could be free to sin. And I think that's the number one mistake people make when they talk about this concept of free will. The will that sins is not free. The will that sins is enslaved. And the enslaved will cannot freely choose to do what is good. Instead, the enslaved will is compelled to do wrong. So imagine that. Imagine truly being a slave to evil and then calling yourself free. From this futile life of sin, and really from the mounting tragedy of its history, Christ has come to set us free. He gives us our liberty. He gives us the liberty to imitate God, who made us and who is himself entirely free. The mind of God is free. The thoughts of God are free. The will of God is free. The grace of God and the acts of God are free. God doesn't depend on anyone. He needs nothing from anyone. He needs nothing at all. He is entirely self-contained, independent, and utterly free. And in that free image we are made. And by Christ's free sacrifice, the free offering of himself, that image in us is restored. And so the only path to freedom is through the cross, where the shackles of sin are broken loose, and the head of the serpent is crushed, and the tyrant of this world is overthrown. We used to know that. We used to believe that. And deep down, I suspect we still do. And so the question now in this hour, in our 246th year, is will enough of us come forward and say it? And saying it, will we live it?